For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eve Zimmerman, director of the Newhouse, and my home is in the East Asian Languages and Cultures Department, my regular home. It's my special pleasure today to kick off our first Newhouse Summer Faculty Fellows series for 2019-2020. This year, for the first time, the Newhouse created a summer fellowship for faculty because we thought that faculty would benefit from some, peace and quiet on campus, and also having a collegial research community around them. And so we had 5, maybe 6 faculty fellows, and Professor Hagimoto. I never know. Is it okay to call you Koichi? Yeah. Well, Professor Hagimoto, to begin, volunteered to go first, and I was very pleased about that. And I had a reason for it, and it has to do with a Facebook accident. One day I opened my laptop to see a conference photo of Professor Hagimoto with Zeli Rivas of the class of '01, a former student of mine who went on to do a PhD in Japanese literature at Berkeley. So there they were, Koichi and Zeli, and they were meeting at a conference convened and planned and everything at Yale by Koichi on the subject of Trans-Pacific. It was the Japanese diaspora to Latin America.
Around the world.
Around the world. Okay. So I thought that was just a wonderful kind of convergence, and it represents what the Newhouse has always valued, crossing borders, both disciplinary and geographical. So I'm very pleased to introduce Koichi to you today. And so here's just a few notes. Koichi specializes in 19th and 20th century Latin American literary and cultural studies, exploring the diverse interactions between Latin America and Asia. His first book, Between Empires, Martí Rizal and the Intercolonial Alliance, 2013, is a study of anti-imperial literature in 19th century Cuba and the Philippines through 2 prominent authors, José Martí and José Rizal. Professor Hagimoto subsequently edited a volume of Trans-Pacific Encounters, Asia and the Hispanic World, 2016. And in this volume, the essays examine the multi-dimensional nature of the historical and cultural connections between the 2 regions. Now, the articles have appeared in many journals, and you're just going to have to put up with my pronunciation. Revista de Crítica Literaria Latinoamericana, Revista Asia America Latina, Chasqui, Transmodernity, Hispania, and Latin American Literary Review, among others. Professor Hagimoto has such a long list of courses that I had to list them out, but here we go. Here are some of them. Introduction to Latin American Studies, Literature and Culture of the Hispanic Caribbean, The Making of Modern Latin American Culture. That sounds very cool. Between Paradise and Prison, Cuban Literature and Culture in Transition, and Asia in Latin America, Literary and Cultural Connections. He is both a recipient, now this is hard to do, of the Pinansky Teaching Prize and the APGAR Award for Teaching Excellence. You are indeed in for a treat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eve, for such a wonderful introduction, for everybody for being here. It is truly an honor to be able to share my project with you all. And of course, I want to start by thanking Eve and Lauren for putting everything together. It's exciting, really, to be part of this amazing community of scholars and faculty and friends. And I want to thank the Newhouse Center for the generous grant that I received over the summer, which allowed me to develop this project, which is part of my larger book manuscript I'm working on. So today, instead of, well, I expect the audience to be pretty diverse, and I think that's one of the purposes, right, of having this kind of talk as well. And I see at least, two colleagues and friends from the Science Center. Thank you, Megan and Yui, for coming. So instead of giving you hyper sort of specialized paper, I sort of wanted to give you a sense of general historical background and the kind of literary analysis that I do in my larger project. And so I hope you learn something new. And also because this is sort of the audience is different from the kind of audience I usually interact with, and my project, my research interests are very specific and specialized, have to do with Asia and Latin America. So I hope this presentation will give you some food for thought and some ideas and some new ideas for readings and reflections later on. For those of us who were at Convocation last week, President Johnson talked about the curriculum of connection, right? And as I reflected on that idea, I realized that my research has to do with this attempt to make connections between seemingly unrelated or unrelatable regions, histories, literatures, memories, and literatures, right? And in this case, between Asia and Latin America. And when you think of Latin America, traditionally, the understanding is that there are many connections in terms of transatlantic relation, right, between Europe and Latin America, with good reasons. History of colonialism, slavery, immigration, just to name a few. And in fact, my good colleagues and friends, Evelina and Antonio, are organizing this amazing series of talks called Transatlantic Visions. So when I sort of started this project on Trans-Pacific studies, I wanted to focus on the other side of Latin America, right? And when I, began my PhD, I discovered that there weren't many scholars and studies sort of exploring these connections in terms of literature, history, and culture. There are people, in political science, economy, who talk about commercial and economic, relations between different countries in Asia and especially China nowadays in Latin America. But I also wanted to focus on the humanities aspect, right? And so my research, for those of you who know me, know that my research is very interdisciplinary by nature, intersection between literature and history. But also I would even argue that it's pretty transdisciplinary, because my idea is to go over, these singular narratives of, Asian studies, Asian American studies, Latin American studies. So I sort of wanted to go beyond these categories of, you may call it area studies model. So I wanted to sort of, explore these connections between, once again, seemingly unrelated or unrelatable regions. This is definitely a work in progress. So I would, be grateful for any suggestion, comments, and feedback, and in the end. So today I'll be giving a talk maybe for 15 minutes. I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A later. Anyway, so the title of my talk today is Samurai in the Land of the Gaucho, the Nikkei Experience and the Culture of Modernity in Argentina. For those of you who are not familiar with the history of Latin America or the history of Japanese sort of diaspora in the world, the word gaucho refers to a kind of cowboy in Argentina, the southern cone. And the word Nikkei means people of Japanese descent. It is also used as a monetary value, on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, but I'm not going to talk about that, obviously. Anyway, in this presentation, I examine the history of Japanese immigration in Argentina through its literary and cultural manifestations. The purpose of this project is twofold. First, my emphasis on the Japanese in Argentina presents an alternative history of Japanese diaspora in Latin America, especially in comparison to Brazil and Peru, the two nations that have the biggest Japanese communities in the continent and that have received most scholarly attention to date. By comparing Argentina to its neighboring countries, my study challenges the temptation to homogenize the Japanese diasporic narrative or to simplify their experience through historical reductionism. Second, my study explores the little-known story of a minority group in Argentina, and in so doing, complicates the discourse of modernity in the country. Often described as a model minority, Japanese immigrants have been considered instrumental symbols of racial and cultural diversity since the 19th century. After reviewing the history of Japanese immigration in Argentina, I will refer to some contemporary works related to the experience of Nikkei, once again, people of Japanese ancestry, including Ana Kazumi Stoll's Flores de un Solo Día, Flowers in a Single Day, and Pablo Moyano's Silencio Roto, 16 Nikkeis, Broken Silence, 16 Nikkeis. My analysis seeks to shed light on the ways in which the emerging Nikkei voices have both contributed to and resisted the narrative of multiculturalism in contemporary Argentina. I'm going to begin with this movie, a recent film, Samurai, from 2012, produced by an award-winning director, Gaspar Schuer. Set in a fictional world loosely based on 19th century history, the movie portrays one of the few representations of historic cultural relationship between Japan and Argentina. In rural Argentina, an elderly Japanese immigrant tells his grandson that a famous samurai from his country, Takamori Saigo, has secretly escaped to Latin America after organizing a failed rebellion against the newly established Meiji government in 1868. According to him, the samurai's mission is to create, and I quote, a new Japan in Argentina. When his grandson, named Takeo, decides to look for the legendary samurai, he comes across a war veteran gaucho known as Poncho Negro, and that's the guy on your left. And together they embark on a quixotic journey across the pampas in the central part of the country. Their search for Saigo, the last samurai, represents an attempt to at once preserve traditions and resist modernity for both Japan and Argentina. One of the highlights of the movie is the relationship between Takeo and Poncho Negro, the samurai and the gaucho, as you see in this picture. At first, the two protagonists are suspicious of each other, with Poncho Negro referring to Takeo ignorantly as Japón, meaning Japan. Nevertheless, the two characters soon begin to establish a closer relationship based on mutual trust as they travel together in search of Saigo. Takeo provides food for both during their journey and feeds the disabled gaucho because he has lost his arm during the war. On his part, Poncho Negro helps Takeo navigate through the hostile environment of the pampas, often speaking Spanish to the locals on his behalf. In symbolic terms, the alliance between Poncho Negro and Takeo is formed partly due to the fact that both characters belong to the marginalized groups in a country dominated by white European immigrants. Neither the Japanese immigrant nor the gaucho, a cowboy often seen as an outlaw, would constitute the mainstream national heritage of Argentina. In this sense, Poncho Negro's unfailing assistance to find Saigo and his selfless dedication to bringing the lost order cannot be taken lightly. On the one hand, it shows the gaucho's reflection of his own marginality in the life of the Asian immigrant. At the same time, it describes Argentina as a kind of refuge where the old Japanese values dismantled by the Meiji Restoration can be restored. Even though in the end, Takeo and Poncho Negro's dream of restoring the tradition is doomed to fail against the force of modernity, the supposed alliance between the two is never tarnished throughout the film. History of Japanese immigration in Argentina. The friendship portrayed by the film provides us with a point of departure to reflect on the history of Japanese immigration in Argentina, which dates back to the early 20th century. As elsewhere in Latin America, the majority of the first immigrants came from Okinawa, also known as the Ryukyu Islands. Unlike the rest of the continent, however, those who settled in Argentina did not arrive directly from Asia, but from neighboring countries, such as Brazil and Peru. Some historians have noted that there were refugees from the poor conditions on the sugar plantations of these two nations, and many of the Japanese pioneers in Argentina entered the country covertly. The first wave of Japanese immigration until World War I can thus be described as an indirect transmigration or remigration. These immigrants viewed Argentina as an alternative not only to their native land, but also to other Latin American nations. Contrasting the Japanese in Argentina to those in Brazil and Peru will illustrate different layers of historical narrative in Latin America. Currently, there are about 1.5 million people of Japanese descent in Brazil and about 160,000 in Peru and 1.4 million in the United States. In contrast, the population of Japanese Argentinians is estimated to be about 35,000, so it's much smaller in scale. One of the most notable differences between Argentina and Brazil is the degree of state-sponsored persecution. In Brazil, the anti-Japanese movement known as Campaña Anti-Nipônica, or anti-Japanese campaign, was notoriously influential in the 1920s. Miguel Couto, one of the most vocal proponents of this movement, believed that the immigration from Japan was a devious plot to overtake the Brazilian nation. Moreover, under the regime of Getúlio Vargas, there were overt attacks against people of Japanese descent through the politics of Estado Novo, new state. Of particular importance was the 1939 campaign called Brasilidade, or Brazilianness, which represented the project of homogenization designed to preserve Brazilian identity. When the country declared war against Japan during World War II, Vargas's propaganda intensified further, turning Japanese Brazilians into enemy aliens. In the similar vein, the Japanese in Peru also endured systematic oppression by the state. One of the most traumatic episodes, perhaps still largely unknown to the American public, is the history of Japanese Peruvians who were sent to US internment camps during World War II. More than 1,700 Japanese Peruvians were illegally kidnapped and deported to internment camps in New Mexico and Texas to be used as prisoner exchanges. Even more tragically, the Peruvian government refused to give them permission to go back to their own country after the war, which forced many of them to stay in America without any family ties or to return to Japan, quote unquote return, where they didn't even speak the language. And Sally, that you mentioned, she's actually working on this project, archive, sort of studying the history of Japanese in testimonials, of Japanese Peruvians who were, who spent some time in internment camps in New Mexico and Texas. Compared to such harsh conditions, the Japanese in Argentina lived under a much more agreeable socio-political climate. Although this does not mean, of course, that they were excluded from racism and discrimination. What I mean is that they normally didn't experience the kind of epistemic violence and erasure from the national consciousness that took place in Brazil and Peru. Instead, according to anthropologist Marcelo Higa, the Japanese in Argentina were treated with positive prejudice by the country's dominant class. The smaller scale of the Japanese community can be explained in at least a couple ways. First, the process of immigration was based not on a government-subsidized contract, keiyaku imin, which was what happened in Brazil and Peru. So there was this company in Japan who sponsored, the immigration from Japan to Brazil and Peru. And in this poster, this father figure with his family, right, is pointing Brazil, right, and the sort of poem, right? The slogan says, "Let's go to South America, with your family," and then there's Brazil and Peru, right? So it was government subsidized program. But in Argentina, it was on their own spontaneous decisions and free will, right? In Japanese, it's called jiyu-imin. Upon their arrival, most of the Japanese immigrants had neither the information about rural conditions nor a large sum of capital investment to start a business. Despite these obstacles, they found employment as taxi drivers, waiters, gardeners, domestic servants, and doorkeepers. The most thriving business was tintoreria, or dry cleaners, the first of which was established in 1921. This industry attracted many Japanese immigrants because, unlike agriculture, it required minimum funds and experience to set up a store. Because of the efficient service at tintoreria, the Japanese gradually gained respect and trust in society, establishing upper working class families. Moreover, their successful assimilation and acculturation can be attributed to at least three social factors. First, the Japanese were unusually open to the local community, admitting native Argentinians to their recreational events, such as sports activities, and also hiring local residents in their businesses. This openness is in sharp contrast to the exclusive nature of the Japanese communities in Brazil and Peru, where the industrial and commercial districts were strictly segregated. At the same time, Argentina's rapid industrialization in the early 20th century allowed Japanese immigrants, many of whom settled in Buenos Aires, to directly interact with urban Argentinians rather than living in isolated rural areas. Second, intermarriage was a common practice for these settlers, even for the first generation of immigrants. The contrast with Brazil and Peru is also stark in this regard. Unlike in Argentina, the Japanese men who first migrated to Peru tended to avoid intermarriage by bringing picture brides from their homeland through the form of yobiyose, or calling. The third element was their willingness to accept the Catholic faith. Although many of these converts were not active members of Catholicism, the adaptation to the country's religion played a significant role in assimilating into the new society. Japan as a symbol of modernity. Grounded in this historical premise, I ask, why did Japanese immigrants have such a positive, quote-unquote, experience in Argentina? What were the political and ideological reasons that contributed to their easier integration process compared to those in Brazil and Peru? What were the factors that made them more acceptable than other Asian immigrants, such as Koreans and Chinese in Argentina? And I have a colleague who is also doing her study on a history of Korean immigration in Argentina. And the Koreans suffered, many episodes of racism and discrimination, especially in the 80s and 90s. Their small number certainly helped avoid unnecessary conflicts both within themselves and against the locals. At the same time, I argue that there was a political motive by Argentina's white elite class that portrayed Japan as an alternative example of modernity and civilization as early as the late 19th century. Some Argentine intellectuals and writers envisioned the desirable image of Japan and the Japanese prior to the beginning of official immigration. In other words, Japanese immigrants constituted a model minority even before they set foot in Argentina. And this was also a time in Argentina where intellectuals, at least some of them, were disillusioned by European sort of model of civilization, and they were looking for an alternative. And Japan sort of became this new model of society, Western society, in many ways, because after the Japanese, Japan-Russo War, Japan sort of emerged as this new superpower, the first sort of non-European country, right, to sort of gain this status in the world. Eduardo Wilde was the first Argentine intellectual to travel to Japan in 1897. And Wilde was not the only Latin American intellectuals who went to Japan at that time. There were diplomats, journalists, writers, or just travelers, from elite classes, right, in Latin America, who went to Japan and sort of, made observations about this new sort of exotic, of course, but interesting nonetheless country. Such as the Guatemalan Enrique Gomez Carillo, the Mexican Jose Juan Tablada, and Tablada was actually the one who introduced the Japanese, form of haiku poetry into Latin America and became a really popular sort of literary instrument in Latin American literature. Eduardo Wilde was the first Argentine intellectual to travel to Japan in 1897. In his travel narrative, Por Mares y por Tierras, by seas and by land, Wilde describes his impressions of the Asian country through hyperbole and meticulousness, like other modernista writers from the period. One of the most distinct aspects of Japan that drew Wilde's attention was its hygienic culture. According to him, the Japanese, and I quote, practiced the hygiene of the soul by working to maintain the calmness of the spirit as well as that of the body, end of quote. By emphasizing the physical cleanness as well as the moral integrity of Japanese people, Wilde examines a broad range of social and cultural issues, not only to suggest that Japan could serve as a new model of modernity for Argentina. In one of his notes, Wilde expresses his wish to promote Japanese immigration in Argentina. But it also must be noted that Wilde was a physician who was concerned about the problem of socio-political and moral decay in 19th century Argentina. For him, therefore, bringing Japanese immigrants would mean not only the introduction of their hygienic culture, but also the construction of a clean, orderly, virtuous society. And in terms of literary modernity and the kind of impact of Japanese haiku that I mentioned, it was also an important sort of way to introduce Japanese literature and tradition, into Latin American culture. Jorge Luis Borges, one of the most important writers of Argentina and Latin America, wrote some haikus. He also wrote a short story about one of the legends, of historical narrative from Japan. And haiku, once again became a really popular sort of literary tool throughout Latin America. And there's a tradition, right, of haiku sort of written in Spanish, either following strictly, right, the style and the form and the aesthetics of Japanese haiku culture, or simply copying sort of, this simplistic style of literature, right, in Spanish. In the 20th century, the relationship between Japan and Argentina cannot be discussed without mentioning Juan Domingo Perón and his first regime between 1946 and 1955. He and his wife, Eva Perón, or Evita, supported the Japanese community in Argentina by sending emergency supplies to their homeland as part of the post-war reconstruction. Evita regarded the Japanese immigrants in Buenos Aires as fellow descamisados, or the shirtless people, like many impoverished Argentinian workers who supported Perón's nationalistic politics. In the speech he delivered in 1949, Perón suggested not only the idea of cohabitation between Japanese and Argentines, but also the mutual respect between the two nations. Here's a quote with my translation. This Japanese community, which in coming together honors itself and honors us with our coexistence, should have the absolute conviction that for us in this land, its members are as Argentines as we are, and receive the same respect as our men. There is no difference between a Japanese man and an Argentine man. End of quote. These remarks about the coexistence can be interpreted as a political campaign through which to celebrate the country's racial diversity. At the same time, his discourse highlights the unique position of Japanese immigrants in comparison to other minority groups such as Koreans and Chinese. By blurring the difference between a Japanese man and Argentine man, Perón grants the Japanese immigrants with a privileged status of purported equality. And this kind of special sort of treatment by the Argentine government takes a different form even in the 21st century. In her recent article, Chisu Teresa Ko describes the Japanese in Argentina as, and I quote, ideal champions of multiculturalism. Her study points to Argentina's redefinition of itself from a homogeneous white culture to a more heterogeneous multicultural one. And largely, this is also a critical sort of response to the 2001 economic crisis that happened in Argentina, because after that crisis, which affected everything about being Argentine, and sort of, the country lost its long-held belief about their own racial and cultural exceptionalism, according to which Argentina is, the whitest and therefore the most advanced country in Latin America. So after 2001, there's this movement about, including other minority groups, and in literature, culture, and, to some extent, political landscape as well. According to Ko, Japanese immigrants play a key role in creating a new paradigm of racial politics in the country because of their ability to reveal both the possibilities and the limits of Argentine multiculturalism. Ko insightfully analyzes examples of Japan's cultural manifestations in Argentina where, and I quote, racial meanings are produced, reiterated, and normalized, and where the nation establishes its diversity. End of quote. The construction of a Japanese-Argentine identity is deeply rooted in the discussion about the national psyche today. At the same time, we can argue that for Argentina, a self-proclaimed melting pot of racial and ethnic blending, known in Spanish as crisol de razas, using Japanese immigrants as instrumental symbols of modernity and diversity is both convenient and practical. Similar to how the idea of Japan was fabricated and idealized by Wilde and Perón based on their political interests, the presence of Japanese immigrants is used strategically in order to celebrate the notion of diversity and multiculturalism in contemporary Argentina. Nikkei voice as a counter-narrative. It is partly for this new emphasis on multiculturalism that a number of literary works by people of Japanese descent were published in Argentina in the last 2 decades. And once again, in Brazil and Peru, there's this long tradition of cultural products produced by people of Japanese descent, Nikkei Brazilians and Nikkei Peruvians, right? Because of the level of sophistication that they work with in terms of literary and cultural dialogue. But in Argentina, this is a new sort of phenomena. For the first time, the Nikkei writers and artists have begun to tell their own stories and present counter-narratives to the dominant image of Japan, rather than having the notion of Japaneseness defined by Argentinians of European descent. For example, I examined the manifestation of multicultural identity in Anna Kazumisto's Flores de un Solo Día, Flowers in a Single Day, from 2002. I argue that the immigrant identity that appears in this novel can be defined not through the conventional hyphenation and biculturalism. And what I mean by that is, the hyphenated identity, right? Japanese hyphen American, Japanese hyphen Brazilian. Instead, it entails the mingling of 3 different cultural contexts, including Japan, Argentina, and the United States. In other words, Kazumisto articulates the immigrant identity in terms of a ternary composing 3 points, rather than a binary construction, thereby challenging the traditional structure of immigrant identity characterized by lineal oppositions. The text calls into question the post-colonial notion of diaspora that is determined exclusively through antithesis, whether between colonizer and colonized, Occident-Orient, master-slave, center-periphery, or self-other. From this perspective, the idea of a ternary, sort of triangular identity embodies the project of decolonization because it rejects the Eurocentric sort of epistemology of binary identitarian politics. In Flores de un Solo Día, the ternary structure is shown in the protagonist Aimé Leverrier, whose identity can only be described as a Japanese hyphen American hyphen Argentine. She was born in America and spent her childhood in New Orleans with her Japanese mother, Hanako, before they moved to Argentina. Aimé's American identity is depicted through her relationship with Bess Tibbetts, a black servant in their home in New Orleans, and who became her second mother and a spiritual teacher when she was young. After moving to Argentina, Aimé quickly finds herself integrated into the new society, fluently speaking porteño, which is a very specific kind of Spanish spoken in Buenos Aires. Her immigrant identity becomes clear through her marriage with Fernando Marconi, a native Argentine of Italian descent. At the same time, Aimé is also a guardian of Japanese culture as she runs a small flower shop in Buenos Aires where Hanako practices the art of ikebana, or flower arrangement. Based on such values as discipline, modesty, and respect, Eimei and Hanako preserve and promote Japanese culture in Argentina. One day, their comfortable life is abruptly interrupted by the arrival of a mysterious letter informing Eimei that her grandmother has passed away in New Orleans and that she is the only heir to an estate that is worth $750,000. Despite her fear of confronting the past, she decides to return to the United States. During her brief journey, she discovers a complex web of family secrets that reveals not only the history of Hanako and herself in Japan and the United States, but also the real reason why they came to Argentina. In the novel, we find Eimei struggling with a conflict between multiple languages when the letter from New Orleans forces her to face the past. It is at this time that she realizes that she no longer feels capable of reading in English, which had been abandoned for 25 years. While she has difficulty deciphering the language, she also perceives the phantom of her 8-year-old self. The blending of English and Spanish, of childhood and adulthood, takes center stage in her narrative as she reads the mysterious letter. And I'm gonna read the paragraph in Spanish, and you can either follow the same quote with me or read the English translation. Revista algunas de ellas, palabras, we duly notify the express agreement, the holder, the owner, not by marriage or blood relation. Y de repente, como un rayo, se le aparece una vocecita en la mente que dice, I am 8, and this is her name is, just for a little, because then to take us back to, ¿es esa su propia voz? ¿De cuándo? ¿A quién está diciendo todo esto? This critical reflection, the encounter with the interior other, so to speak, is possible only through her Japanese mother, who gently encourages her to go back to the States. It is Hanako's quiet gesture that helps Eimei make up her mind. And I quote, Hanako's expression demonstrated the sweet assurance that is characteristic of her, the opposite of doubt. And harmony seems to be embodied in her physical features. End of quote. By creating a dramatic sense of Latin American telenovela, the novel describes the confluence of 3 countries and cultures as its characters navigate through different geographical spaces and historical times. So for me, this idea of constructing an immigrant identity through 3 points of reference, right, rather than a simple opposition or singular narrative, is suggestive and provides perhaps an alternative understanding of what it means to be an immigrant in this multicultural society. Another cultural product related to the Japanese in Argentina is the recent documentary Silencio Roto, 16 Nikkei, from 2015. Broken Silence, 16 Nikkeis, which tells the story of Nikkei Argentinians who lost their family members during the military dictatorship in the late 1970s. It is well known that the countries in the Southern Cone went through an especially tremulous period in the 1960s and 70s. In Argentina, state terrorism began in 1973 with the establishment of the Argentine anti-communist alliance known as the AAA. The violence intensified after the military coup that led to the famous Dirty War, or La Guerra Sucia, from 1976 to 83, causing more than 30,000 deaths and disappearances, the so-called desaparecidos, the missing ones. And here in this picture, you see, the famous mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, who still today continue to go to the street, claiming information about their missing children, grandchildren, siblings, cousins. So it's an important symbol of justice and historical memory. It is said that the victims of systematic incarceration, torture, and murder were not persecuted because of their Japaneseness, as had been the case in the anti-Japanese campaigns that took place in Brazil and Peru during World War II, like we saw earlier. Instead, they were arrested as Argentines and because of their ideologies and activism. Until recently, the presence of these desaparecidos of Japanese descent was unknown, and this movie, this documentary, Silencio Roto, provides the first public forum to document this history. What is interesting to me is that there was something distinctively Japanese in the mindset of the families of the Nikkei desaparecidos. The families who appear in the film said they were reluctant to talk about their missing siblings and children, whose activism was considered an act of dishonor, as in the Japanese tradition. In my larger book, I also talk about this culture of silence in Japanese tradition, and respect for the authority. Unlike the West, Japan has always embraced and even institutionalized silence sort of as an essential mode of communication, as well as a moral principle, right? On the Confucius ethics of obedience, hierarchy, and honor. And according to this view, people must adhere to the virtues of loyalty, filial piety, and the power of authority can never be questioned. According to one interviewee in the film, and I quote, "Having a son who was an activist, regardless of party, and presenting himself against the government, the country that took us in, was a dishonor." Another member relates the silence of the Japanese community to the attitude of obedience, and I quote, "I think the cultural question of submission, of Japanese obedience to authority in general, could have influenced the collective silence." End of quote. Here, the ethics of Confucianism seem to be at work for the collective silence of Japanese Argentinians and their unwillingness to question the authority. As the director explains, and I quote, "The title, Broken Silence, has to do with the process of breaking silence in order to unite the families, to be present in protest, to recognize their brothers, children, and uncles." End of quote. And this is a picture of the families of the Nikkei desaparecidos. They now know sort of their own stories. They can share their pain, at least in the group, and sort of became a public symbol of people of Japanese descent who were sort of part of this systematic injustice. In fact, the title of the documentary is symbolic in a number of ways. First, the silence of the Nikkei families is broken for the first time in order for truth to emerge and for justice to be served. At the same time, the film implicitly criticizes the silence of the Japanese government that refused to help the Nikkei community at difficult times. The families of the victims recount that they felt abandoned by the Japanese embassy in Buenos Aires, even though they requested interventions in various occasions. The government believed that Japan should not get involved in the domestic affair of Argentina, but the truth is that the Nikkei desaparecidos included at least 2 dual citizens and 1 Japanese national. Moreover, as Diego Aldue's study points out, Japan's refusal to help Nikkei Argentinians is in contrast to the readiness of other countries, such as France, Italy, and Germany, to facilitate the escape of dissidents or petition habeas corpus during the dictatorship. Finally, the film also presents an alternative history to the dominant discourse of Argentinian nationalism, in which the question of race is disregarded and the Nikkei voice is silenced. By uncovering the Japanese experience in the collective national memory, the film offers a counter-narrative to the homogenizing, essentializing identity of the country. As an unspoken voice, silence exposes multiple layers of uncomfortable truth regarding the history of violence and trauma. And I'm gonna end with some concluding remarks. Traditionally, the images of Japan and the perceptions of Japan and the Japanese have been constructed exclusively by Argentinians of European descent, many of whom were men. And those images were uncomplicatedly positive and usually involved certain political interests. In my view, Argentina conceived their own notion of Japan in order to reclaim its Western ideologies, whether in the form of modernity, diversity, or multiculturalism. This positive reflection of Japan did not change with the arrival of Japanese immigrants in the early 20th century. In fact, the Argentine government continued to portray them as a privileged, model minority compared to other regions. It is only through the emergence of literary and cultural products from the Japanese community itself in the last 2 decades that the representation of Japan became more complicated, nuanced, and de-orientalized. And in my larger work, I also talk about other works by Nikkei writers, including Gaijin by Maximiliano Matayoshi, meaning foreigner, Los árboles caídos también son el bosque, the trees, the fallen trees are part of the forest, which is a collection of short stories by Alejandra Camilla. What Walter Migliolo calls the decolonization of knowledge and subjectivity allows Nikkei Argentinians to disrupt the dominant discourse of nationalism and universalism. Understanding the unique history of the Japanese in Argentina paints an alternative picture of Japanese diaspora in the continent. At the same time, it is safe to argue that the multifaceted nature of Nikkei identity allows us to reconceptualize the notions of race, ethnicity, culture, and citizenship in Latin America and beyond. Thank you. So I know we have some time for Q&A, and I appreciate any comments, criticism, or advice. Yes.
It certainly is not a criticism, expression of gratitude to you for an erudite presentation you just gave. I have a rather specific question. Mm-hmm. After the end of the World War II, a large number of German Jews went to Argentina, as well as former Nazi officers. I'm sure they were not in very good terms. But both the German Jews and the Japanese Argentinians were dissidents, refugees, if you will. And I wonder, you mentioned earlier in your presentation, many of the Japanese who went to Latin America were from Okinawa. And within Japan, Okinawans were considered marginal dissidents. I wonder if the Japanese in Argentina and the Jews in Argentina ever got together to work on a common, whatever, project.
Right.
Yeah.
Not that I know of. I mean, that's an interesting comparison to make, and certainly, there are certain, interests that they share, right? Political ideologies and social status as well. But from my research, I haven't really seen any sort of alliance or relationship between these two groups. The second part of of this question has to do with the positionality of Okinawans versus Naichijin, right? People from the mainland Japan, and I think that sort of gives a different narrative also of Japanese immigration, especially in Latin America, because Okinawans, many of them were not considered Japanese, right? And they had a different history, different language, and so forth. So to some extent, there were certain conflicts and tensions between people, who came from the mainland Japan, and people who came from Okinawa. But also there were people who came from Kyushu, Kagoshima, or other parts of Japan. And relatively speaking, I think the question of Japaneseness was ambiguous, in that way. And I don't that's something I want to sort of look into further. How sort of this discourse of national identity from Okinawa, how and the difference between that Okinawan identity and the Japanese mainland identity, how that difference gets translated into sort of this immigrant social environment in Argentina. But yeah, thank you. Yes.
I have another question about the early stages of the immigration. You said that those people who went to Argentina was mostly through the Jiu immigration, the free will immigration. So compared to the Geiyaku immigration, how is the difference? What is the difference between those two? I mean, if somebody could actually choose their fate through the immigration, then they must have the right reason to do that.
Right.
Apart from the contract between the company and as a worker. So would you just be more specific about that?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, those first sort of immigrants who went to Argentina didn't come from Japan directly, right? And they came from other countries. They first went to Brazil or Peru through Keiyaku Imin, government sort of sponsored program. And then they were really disillusioned by the conditions in which they found themselves, right? The condition of agriculture, the soil wasn't as fertile as they had heard. It wasn't very productive. The weather was not cooperative either. And they struggle with these conditions, and they discovered that Argentina, the country was going through this process of modernity and also being sort of a country of immigration, partly largely from Europe. So Argentina, they, by free will, they decided to abandon their first place of immigration. And then they went to Argentina. Same thing, in a way, happened with Bolivia. Some of them, who went to Brazil and Peru, and they, wanted to escape that poor conditions. and went to another country. So the kind of immigrant sort of narrative that we often hear is that you come from one place to another and that's it. But that's not always the case. People move around, back and forth, but also from one place to another and then move to a different place. So I think what I am interested in this project is really to complicate this narrative of immigrant identity and what it means for an immigrant, to live in this sort of flexible space, always moving around to some extent. And that also reminds me of how there were, this has really nothing to do with my current project, but I have a colleague who's working on the history and the historical narrative of Nikkei Brazilians who sort of went back, quote unquote, to Japan as dekasigi migrants because the economy in Japan was doing much better. So there were Brazilians, right, of Japanese descent, but they found better opportunities in Japan. So in Brazil, they were totally racialized, othered, and then they go back. They sort of go to Japan, and they also face the same struggle of not belonging, not being part of this homogeneous society. And so it's a really intricate relationship also between what happened in Latin America, but also what's happening with Latin American Nikkei immigrants in Japan. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes.
I thought this was just a really great talk. And I was wondering, you mentioned the Borges stories that feature Japan, but also the haikus. And I was wondering, since a lot of your evidence is literary, if there are formal aspects to the story, so you also have that sort of moment where the protagonist is thinking in sort of both English and Spanish. Are there formal aspects to the story that are also kind of interestingly intermediate or triangulated in the way that you're describing? I'm thinking about sort of like plot arcs or particular uses of syntax or other kind of literary devices that mark this triangulation that you're tracing.
That's a really interesting question. And I guess I want to know what you mean by formal, I guess, so I can answer the question.
Maybe something innovative. I'm thinking about like the way that people sometimes talk about post-colonial literatures as kind of being a riff on certain kinds of forms from the from the colonial countries. So there's something similar, but also something like innovative and different going on that if read poorly, reads as derivative, but in fact, a number of really great post-colonial scholars have talked about the ways in which those are actually like really, beautiful innovations. So, so that's sort of, I don't know. I mean, I don't work on Japan or Latin America, so it's more just curiosity.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting question. And the way I look at, post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies is sort of, from Latin American perspective, right? Asia sort of was this mysterious non-Western other, right? So I'm interested in this relationship between sort of the two non-Western subjects. And the question becomes, what happens if the subaltern starts speaking to the other subaltern, right? Without or with the lens of European mentality. Aníbal Quijano talks about the coloniality of power. So I'm interested in the power dynamics also, like what happens, right? As I said, when one other, right, starts talking to the other sort of two marginalized subjects. Is there a kind of alliance, sort of in relation to or vis-a-vis European self, so to speak, or would there be a different kind of power structure, right? And so that's the kind of question that I'm grappling with in my project. And when it comes to Borges, like Borges is everywhere. Like he talks about everything, and he's very, his own world, right? And there are certainly people who look at Japan and Japanese haiku through, stereotypes and negative images or orientalized sort of vision. But in the case of Borges, there's this really interesting creative sort of fantasy and translation because Japan and the history of Chushingra in Japanese folk tradition sort of gets translated creatively into his own world of fantasy. So it's neither Japanese nor Argentinian. That's his own sort of world. So that's sort of one aspect of that kind of interaction between Japan and Argentina, and how the symbol of Japan, is perceived in many different ways by both Argentinians and also in relation to by Argentinians of European descent. I don't know if that answers your question, but. Yeah.
In response to the question, I'm thinking about a short story by Borges called The Garden of the Forking Paths, in which he creates, he appropriates a vision of Asian mystery and problem solving.
China is definitely there, right?
And really kind of honors aesthetically and in terms of forms the way an Asian creator would create a world. And his contemporary is Perón, who you showed up the slide up there.
Right.
And I'm thinking of how he's perceiving as politically advantageous to appeal to the descamisados, the urban workers who are immigrants, but at the same time to kind of do a shout out to the Axis, sort of the sort of anti-democratic government of Japan at the time. So you have these two contemporaries who are looking at Asia and using it very differently. And I would argue that Borges is the much more humanitarian, even though he politically you could put him at times on the right, certainly in the 60s. But if you take him at World War II with Perón, they are both using Japan very differently. And you would say that the kind of political theory that Perón exposes is much more towards what Japan was at that time, an Axis power. It's a fascinating.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everything you're saying, and I really I'm excited to be able to hear from you, share my project. The last time anyone really paid serious attention to my research, at Wellesley, I think was when I came here as a job candidate, right? So I'm like, okay, now I need to work on this topic, this area. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I also really enjoyed the talk, and I would want to say, despite the fact that I thought, based on your title, the samurai and the land of the gaucho, I thought your talk was going to go in a really different direction. I thought it was going to be much more about conflicting masculinities, the kind of the strength of these manly stereotypes. And so in the end, I also thought the moment that was really illuminating was actually when the woman writer is moving between the languages. And so I guess that leads me to the question about and this woman writer, you said she lived in the U.S. but then goes to Argentina, or maybe it was I don't know if it was the author who was in the plot at this point, I forget, I'm sorry, but that she ends up marrying an Argentine man, and this question of assimilation, you know, outside of the Confucian ideal of the family, you also have women and of course men marrying Argentinian citizens.
Right.
And so I guess I'm interested in hearing more about the question of conflicting masculinity, but also the role of assimilating
Right.
through marriage and
Yeah.
second generation.
Right. No, that's a really interesting and subject that I would love to explore. And there are, you know, scholars who done some work, you know, comparing the symbol of samurai, you know, to the symbol of gaucho, you know, this macho symbol, but also like virility and, you know, loyalty and the question of honor, outlaws. So there are certain, you know, points of comparison to be made, certainly. But the question of gender, I mean, I think that's, I haven't really explored that subject, so I'm grateful for suggesting that. And in terms of this family structure, and that's also, you know, something that I've been interested in, like in terms of like intermarriage, what happens to the question of language, right? One language gets lost, one language gets more dominated, and the question of offspring, of course, right? The first generation is different, you know, the perception of both Japan and Argentina is different, you know, for the first generation of immigrants than for the second and the third generations of immigrants. So I'm curious to know, to find out more about that too. But thank you. Yeah. Yes.
How are we doing?
Good
Oh,
with me.
yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that one of the things that I was most interested in is the concept of triangulation. So this, that, and the other, as opposed to this and that. Okay? And you made that most explicit in your reading of the novel of immigrant experience, right? You know, you three places. But it seems like that triangle is everywhere in the talk, and I was wondering if you could be even more explicit about how you see this working and what you're interested in. And so I saw it, you know, when you were just talking about samurai, the alignment or the conversation between the two subalterns, right? What happens then? And it seems like it's there too when you're talking about, on one hand, the idealization of the Japanese is the ideal, right? What happens then to the third part of the triangle in that configuration, but then also, you know, with some of the, as you were talking about, sending the Japanese to the internment camps, right? Some of the more violent incidents. So I guess I have a couple questions. So one question that comes to mind is that triangle, is it helpful in thinking about contemporary, kind of the contemporary, you know, the novels, the works that you're interested in contemporary Argentine culture and literature within Argentina? Is that triangle helpful, or is it more complicated than that, or what do you do with the triangle? I guess
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And even, you know, from the very first moment of, you know, I talked about transmigration. So Japan sort of was viewed not just, you know, as alternative, Argentina was viewed not just as alternative to Japan, but also to other countries like Brazil, right? So there's that triangle as well. In terms of like the applicability of this notion of triangular sort of identity, that's something I want to like sort of push, because you know there aren't many sort of theories or conceptualization of. I mean, there is this notion of third space, like Homi Baba talks about the third space, ambivalence, and unhomeliness, right? And so this specific symbol of triangle, I don't know how, I guess depending on the kind of ethnic identities or racial sort of groups that you're talking about in Argentina, depends, right? Also because of the power structure and power dynamics. I don't know where I was gonna go with that idea. But for instance, right, there was a mention about the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, which is huge, right? So, you can easily talk about like the triangle sort of relationship, at least, right, between the Jews and the indigenous community in Argentina, which, people rarely talk about as well, and also the presence of, sort of Afro-Argentinians, which is another sort of marginalized subject in Argentina. And there's also, the discourse of nationalism, what it means to be Argentinian, national identity is always at the center, right? So I guess what I'm really trying to do is to both redefine the notion of, nation to some extent, but also complicate the philosophy of multiculturalism. And because multiculturalism, and, just like the notion of diversity, is not as simple and, celebratory as it sounds, right?
So I just wanted to go back to this triangle notion and to say that when I was looking at the slide, it's very curious to me as a scholar of Japanese literature that what's breaking through her memory of childhood, being 8, is English, and is this legalistic language. And so I felt that the triangulation was more of a block, that English was blocking any kind of access she had to a notion of authenticity or Japaneseness or what that could be. And if you think about the power, the hegemonic role played by America in the post-war era in Japan, but in some sense it's that block in a way. I sort of read it in a kind of even psychoanalytic. These
That's
words
true.
are coming back.
And also, for those of you who, study ikebana, know that ikebana, this art of flower arrangement, one of the purposes of flower arrangement is to make a triangle, between 3 different sort of flowers, seeds, mundane sort of, leaves. But it could sort of represent, heaven and the earth, and I don't remember the third one. Men, right? Yeah, that's right. Human, right? So even in the ikebana practice, the triangle, I think, is an important sort of philosophy. Just occurred to me now. Yeah. Do we have time? Okay. Yes.
No, thanks for the great talk. I learned a lot, inspired me to think about a lot more.
Thank you.
One question I have, my research deals with information flows, among other things, in the Edo period. I'm really interested about the nitty-gritty of information flows in Wheelbay's generation. How is he getting his Japan? He travels there. Does he have any Japanese interlocutors? Is he reading anything in Japanese?
Yeah, his knowledge of Japan, of course, was from France and Spain at that time. These intellectuals were educated in Europe, and so they were reading in French about Japan, and because there weren't many translations. These, sort of high-class elites, right, from Latin America, they acted like Europeans, right, going to Japan. So they were very, they had this huge distance, from the general public, that was what was going on in Latin America. But the kind of, information flow, I think, you mentioned is interesting because Europe was, of course, the center of information at that time. And these people who went to Japan looked at Japan through European lens, Western, sort of epistemologies. But they were also sufficiently critical of European sort of old model, and they were, themselves Guatemalans or Argentinians, and they wanted to do, as I said, they were looking for something new, and Japanese model sort of was convenient. What I mean by convenient is that they weren't really looking for Asia, so to speak, because Japan at that time was the west of Asia, and it was, after the Meiji Restoration, it became more westernized, and so to some extent, these Latin American intellectuals were interested in the Western sort of Japan, and that's what got me interested. And so, of course, there are, stereotypes, very negative depictions or masculine sort of perspectives of Japanese women at that time, right? You guys, you've seen the geisha movie, right? Memories of geisha. That's what it is, right? So there's something, of course, to be critical about it, definitely. But what got me interested is how the kind of Orientalism that was, sort of going on in Europe at that time, and how that perspective of Orientalized vision was different from the kind of Orientalized, nonetheless, vision that was sort of, taking place in Latin America. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.